As he walked back down Maple Street, the familiar sights of his town seemed somehow different. The local coffee shop, the park bench where he liked to sit and read the newspaper, even the old library, all of it suddenly felt foreign, as if he no longer belonged in the town he had lived in for so long. He had always been treated with respect, with dignity. To be spoken to like that, to be dismissed so casually, was a blow he hadn't expected. And yet there it was, the reality sinking in deeper with each step he took. Walter returned to his modest home, a small, comfortable bungalow where he had lived for decades. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the quiet street. The house was filled with memories, the echoes of a life well lived. But today, those memories felt distant, overshadowed by the bitter taste left by that encounter at the deli. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat there for a long time, thinking. This was just a small thing, wasn't it? A rude manager, a changed deli, nothing more. But the longer he sat, the more he realized that it wasn't just about the sandwich or the deli. It was about something bigger, about how the world had changed around him, about how people like Kevin didn't seem to have time or patience for someone like him anymore. Walter wasn't angry, not exactly. But he wasn't going to forget this either. A decision began to form in his mind, one that took shape slowly, like a distant storm gathering strength on the horizon. Walter had always been a quiet man, a man who avoided conflict, who believed in letting things go. But something about today's encounter wouldn't let him do that. It wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about respect, about holding on to the dignity that he had worked for his entire life. Later that afternoon, Walter made a phone call. He hadn't spoken to his lawyer in years, but now it seemed like the right time. It was a brief conversation, filled with polite pleasantries, but the message was clear. Walter wanted to discuss the property he owned, the very building the deli was housed in. It had been in his family for generations, a fact that few people knew. It was time, he thought, for some changes. As he hung up the phone, Walter felt a sense of calm settle over him, a quiet resolve. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. Things were going to change. Not just for him, but for the town, for people like Kevin, who thought they could treat others without kindness, without respect. Walter might have been old, but he wasn't done fighting for what was right. Tomorrow, when he walked down Maple Street, the world might look different again. But this time, Walter would be ready for it. Walter's phone call to his lawyer was the first step in what would become a quiet storm brewing over the town. He had never thought of himself as someone who wielded much power. He had lived humbly, never flashing the wealth his family had accumulated over the years, and after retiring from his job as a teacher, he had settled into a comfortable, unassuming life. But now, as he sat in his small bungalow, staring at the papers his lawyer had sent over, he began to realize just how much influence he truly held. The property on Maple Street had been in his family for generations. Walter's grandfather had bought up several buildings in town during the economic boom of the 1950s, and though many of the properties had been sold off over the years, the deli was one of the few that remained under the Davis name. It had always seemed like a minor detail to Walter, a simple fact about his family's history that didn't mean much in the day-to-day workings of his life. But now, as he looked at the deed in front of him, the power that came with owning that building felt tangible, almost heavy. It wasn't about the money. Walter wasn't interested in making a profit off the building, and he certainly wasn't trying to evict anyone out of spite. But the way Kevin had treated him, dismissive, condescending, as though Walter was a relic from a forgotten time, had ignited something in him. It wasn't just about a sandwich. It was about respect, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin needed to learn a lesson about treating people with decency. The more Walter thought about it, the more he realized that his desire for change went beyond the deli. Over the years, the town had shifted in ways that left him feeling like an outsider. The old stores he had grown up with had been replaced by chain businesses. The quiet, tree-lined streets had given way to busy thoroughfares crowded with cars and delivery trucks. Even the people seemed different, less friendly, less inclined to stop and chat on the sidewalk. Walter missed the sense of community that had once defined his hometown, and now he had an opportunity to do something about it. He spent the next few days walking the town as he always did, but this time with a new perspective. He observed the hustle and bustle of Maple Street, the way people hurried in and out of shops without so much as a glance at one another. He saw how Kevin ran the deli like a factory line, churning out sandwiches with no regard for the customers he served. And most of all, he saw how no one seemed to care about the little things that had once made the town special, like taking the time to make a simple ham and cheese sandwich for an old man who had been a loyal customer for decades. It wasn't long before word got out about the sale of the building. Walter had kept his involvement in the background, choosing to work through his lawyer to handle the transaction. The buyer was a company from out of town, a developer who specialized in revitalizing small commercial districts. The plan was to refurbish the building and attract new businesses that would breathe life back into Maple Street. At first, it seemed like a win-win situation. The town needed fresh energy, and the developer promised to maintain the historical charm of the area while modernizing the facilities. But as the sale progressed, the reality of what this meant for the deli began to sink in. Kevin received an eviction notice, delivered in a plain envelope one morning before the deli opened. It was a shock, to say the least. The business had been doing well, and Kevin had been making plans to expand, possibly adding a catering service or opening a second location in the next town over. The notice came out of nowhere, and Kevin couldn't believe it. He stormed into the back office, crumpling the paper in his fist as he tried to make sense of it. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered to himself, dialing the number for the property management company listed on the notice. But when he got through to the office, the response was cold and impersonal. The sale had already gone through. There was nothing Kevin could do but pack up and vacate within 60 days. For the first time in his tenure as manager, Kevin felt completely out of control. He had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation, no matter how difficult. But this was different. This wasn't a problem he could solve by barking orders at his staff or cutting costs. His livelihood was at stake, and there was no way to stop the train that was already barreling down the tracks toward him. As the news spread, the town's reaction was mixed. Some of the older residents, those who remembered the deli as it had been under Mrs. O'Donnell's ownership, were quietly pleased. They had never liked Kevin's brusque attitude, and though they had continued to frequent the deli out of habit, there was a sense that the place had lost its soul under his management. Others, particularly the younger crowd who appreciated the modern, fast-paced service, were more sympathetic. They saw Kevin as a hard worker who was just trying to make a name for himself in a competitive business. But no one seemed to know that Walter was behind the sale. He had kept his involvement a closely guarded secret, not out of shame, but because he didn't want to make this about himself. He didn't want people to see him as vindictive or petty. In his mind, this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance to the town, about making sure that people like Kevin understood that how you treat others matters. Still, Walter couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he walked past the deli a week later and saw Kevin sitting alone at a corner table, staring blankly at the eviction notice. For a moment, Walter considered going inside, perhaps striking up a conversation and offering some words of wisdom. But what could he say that would make a difference? Kevin wouldn't listen to him, not after everything that had happened. And besides, Walter wasn't sure he wanted to get involved any more than he already had. Instead, Walter continued on his way, his cane tapping lightly on the pavement as he made his way down the street. He didn't know exactly what the future held for the town, but he was certain of one thing: change was coming, and it was long overdue. As the weeks passed, the deli's closure became inevitable. Kevin tried to rally support from the community, but his efforts fell flat. The eviction notice had cast a shadow over the business, and even the loyal customers began to drift away. Unsure of what would happen next, it wasn't long before the deli's once bustling dining area became eerily quiet. the tables empty and the smell of fresh bread replaced by the faint scent of disappointment. Walter, for his part, watched from a distance, unsure whether he had done the right thing. He had set out to teach Kevin a lesson, but now that the deli was on the verge of closing, he wondered if his actions had gone too far. After all, people depended on that deli, young employees who needed the work, regular customers who had made it a part of their daily routine. Was it fair to take that away from them, even if Kevin had been disrespectful? One afternoon, Walter sat in the park, watching the leaves fall from the trees in a slow, steady cascade. As he sat there, lost in thought, a familiar face approached him. It was Sandra, a woman in her early 30s who had grown up in the town and now worked as a freelance journalist. She had always been fond of Walter, often stopping to chat with him during her walks through the park. "Mr. Davis," she said, sitting down on the bench beside him. "I heard about the deli. A lot of people are talking about it." Walter nodded, his eyes still fixed on the trees. "It's a shame," he said softly, "but maybe it was time for a change." Sandra glanced at him, her expression curious. "I heard rumors that you might have something to do with it," she said cautiously. "Is that true?" Walter smiled faintly, but didn't answer. Instead, he looked out at the park, at the children playing and the couples walking hand in hand. "Sometimes," he said after a long pause, "people need to be reminded of what's important." Sandra nodded, sensing that there was more to the story than Walter was letting on. But she didn't press him for details. Instead, she sat quietly beside him, both of them watching as the town they loved continued to change around them. The next phase of Walter's plan was already in motion, but what would come of it remained to be seen. The news of the deli's imminent closure spread through the town like wildfire. It became the topic of conversation in every corner of Maple Street, at the grocery store, in the coffee shop, even during Sunday service at the local church. People speculated about what would happen next. Would another business take over the space? Would the entire block be remodeled? And most of all, people wondered about Kevin, the once confident manager now faced with the grim reality of losing everything he'd worked for. Kevin himself was in disbelief. Just a few months ago, he had been making plans to expand the deli, talking to vendors about increasing their supply, and even negotiating a deal to open a second location in a neighboring town. He had big dreams, dreams of turning the deli into a brand that could thrive beyond Maple Street. But now, all of that had crumbled in the blink of an eye. Every night he stayed late, poring over financial statements and trying to figure out where it all went wrong. He felt powerless, watching his future unravel and realizing he had no control over the forces that were pulling it apart. The eviction notice haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was personal, that this wasn't just a business decision, but a message aimed directly at him. He had always believed that success was about being tough, about making quick decisions and showing no weakness. That's how he had run the deli since taking over. And yet, here he was, facing the reality that maybe his approach had been wrong. Kevin's first instinct was to fight back. He began contacting local officials, trying to figure out who had bought the building and whether there was any way to negotiate. Every conversation led to a dead end. The building had been sold to a developer from out of town, and the deal was finalized. No one knew much about the buyer, just that they specialized in revitalizing small towns. But what did that mean? Was the deli part of the plan, or was it collateral damage in a broader scheme? One morning, Kevin sat in his office staring at the eviction notice when a thought crossed his mind. Maybe, just maybe, the previous owner had something to do with this. He knew the deli had been owned by the Davis family for years, and though he had never met Walter Davis personally, he had heard stories about the old man. Could it be that Walter had a hand in this? Kevin wasn't sure, but the idea gnawed at him. Driven by a mixture of desperation and curiosity, Kevin decided to confront Walter directly. He knew where Walter lived. Everyone in town did. So one afternoon, he marched down Maple Street, his anger simmering just below the surface. He had never been one to back down from a confrontation, and today would be no different. When Kevin reached Walter's house, the modest bungalow with its neatly trimmed hedges, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation. But his frustration pushed him forward. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest, and waited. After a few moments, the door opened, and there stood Walter, leaning on his cane, his eyes calm but curious. "Can I help you?" Walter asked, his voice steady but with a hint of wariness. Kevin wasted no time. "I think you know why I'm here," he said, his tone sharp. "I've been served an eviction notice, and I can't help but feel like you had something to do with it." Walter didn't flinch. He looked at Kevin for a long moment, then stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. Kevin hesitated, surprised by the invitation, but eventually followed Walter into the house. They sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Walter didn't offer him a drink or even a seat, and Kevin stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I know you own the building," Kevin said, getting straight to the point. "And I know you could have stopped this from happening. So why didn't you?" Walter leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Kevin's. "You think this is about the building?" he asked quietly. "You think this is just about money or business?" Kevin frowned, taken aback. "Isn't it?" he shot back. "If it's not, then what the hell is this all about?" Walter sighed, his expression softening. "It's about more than that, Kevin. It's about the way you treat people. You've been running that deli like it's some kind of factory, pushing people through the line like they don't matter. I've been coming to that place for years, decades even, and you couldn't even make me a simple sandwich. It's not about the sandwich. It's about respect." Kevin's face flushed with anger. "Respect," he repeated incredulously. "You're closing down my business because of a sandwich." Walter shook his head. "No, I'm not closing it down. I'm making room for something better." For the first time, Kevin felt a flicker of doubt. "Better," he echoed. "What does that mean?" Walter paused, choosing his words carefully. "The town is changing, Kevin. People are changing. And they want more than just fast service and cheap food. They want a place where they feel welcome, where they feel like they matter. You had a chance to give them that, but you chose not to. So now, someone else will." Kevin stared at Walter, speechless. He had never considered that his approach to running the deli might be the problem. He had always thought that efficiency and speed were what mattered most in the food business. But now, standing in Walter's living room, he realized that maybe he had been wrong. "So what happens now?" Kevin asked, his voice quieter, the fight draining out of him. Walter leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Now," he said, "the deli will be turned into something better. My nephew is taking over the building. He's planning to open a new cafe, a place where people can come and sit, where the food is good, but the atmosphere is even better. It'll still be part of the town's history, but it'll be something new, something fresh." Kevin felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was more than just losing his business. It was a complete shift in the town's dynamic. He had never imagined that Walter's family would be the ones to swoop in and make changes. The Davis name carried weight in the town, and if Walter's nephew was involved, then it meant the deli would be in good hands. But where did that leave Kevin? "And me?" Kevin asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What am I supposed to do?" Walter looked at him for a long moment before answering. "That's up to you," he said simply. "You can choose to be bitter, to let this be the end of your story. Or you can learn from it, find a new way to do things, and move forward. This town isn't done with you, Kevin, but you have to decide how you want to be part of it." Kevin didn't respond. He felt the weight of Walter's words settle over him, heavy and uncomfortable. He had come here looking for a fight, but what he found instead was a lesson, one he hadn't expected, but one he couldn't ignore. As Kevin left Walter's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the. He had succeeded in creating a place that welcomed everyone, a place that felt like it belonged to the town, not just to one person. But even as the cafe thrived, the absence of Kevin's Deli still lingered in the air, especially for those who had grown accustomed to his brusque, no-nonsense style. Some missed the speed and efficiency, the quick in-and-out convenience of grabbing a sandwich and leaving without much thought. They complained that the cafe, with its laid-back atmosphere and long waits for food, wasn't the same. Yet, as the months rolled on, most of them accepted the change, adjusting to the new rhythm of Maple Street. Kevin, meanwhile, had disappeared from the public eye for a time. After closing down the deli, he had packed up and left town for a few weeks, retreating to his sister's place in a nearby city. The eviction had hit him hard, not just financially but emotionally. He hadn't realized how much of his identity was tied to that deli until it was gone. For years, he had thought of himself as the man who ran the fastest, most efficient sandwich shop in town. But now that it was all behind him, Kevin was forced to confront a question he had been avoiding for too long. Who was he without the deli? For a while, Kevin tried to distance himself from the past. He avoided Maple Street altogether, finding it too painful to walk by the cafe and see his former customers inside, smiling and enjoying themselves. But as much as he tried to move on, something kept pulling him back. It wasn't just the loss of his business. It was the nagging feeling that he had failed, not just in running the deli, but in the way he had treated people. Eventually, Kevin returned to Maple Street, but he didn't come back as the same man who had run the deli. He came back humbled, with a new perspective on life and on business. After weeks of soul-searching, Kevin realized that Walter had been right. It wasn't the sandwich that had caused the downfall of his deli. It was his attitude, his failure to understand that people needed more than just a quick meal. They needed kindness, connection, and respect. When Kevin returned, he didn't waste any time feeling sorry for himself. He rented a small storefront on the quieter side of town, far from the hustle and bustle of Maple Street. It was a modest space, nothing fancy, but it was exactly what Kevin needed. He decided to start fresh, with a new cafe of his own, one that would be different from the deli in every way. This time, there would be no rushing, no cutting corners. Kevin wanted to create a place where people could come in, sit down, and feel like they belonged. He named the cafe Second Chances, a nod to the journey he had been on since losing the deli. The name resonated with the community, many of whom were curious to see what Kevin had done with the place. Word spread quickly, and soon enough, people began to trickle in. At first, it was just a few familiar faces, former customers who were curious about what Kevin was up to. But soon, the cafe began to attract a steady stream of regulars, people who had never set foot in the old deli but had heard good things about this new venture. Kevin made sure to greet every customer with a smile, something he had never bothered to do at the deli. He took the time to chat with them, asking about their day, their families, their lives. And the customers responded in kind. They appreciated the effort Kevin put into making the cafe feel like a home away from home, a place where they could relax and enjoy not just the food but the experience. The menu at Second Chances was simple but heartfelt, much like the name. Kevin offered classic comfort food, soups, sandwiches, and homemade pies, all made from scratch. There was nothing fancy about the place, but that was exactly the point. It was warm, welcoming, and real, much like Kevin had learned to be. As the weeks went by, Kevin noticed something surprising. Many of his former deli customers had found their way to the new cafe. People who had once only cared about getting their food quickly now lingered at the tables, savoring their meals and chatting with Kevin and each other. The transformation was slow, but it was real. The town had changed, and so had Kevin. One afternoon, a familiar figure walked through the doors of Second Chances. It was Walter, his cane tapping softly on the wooden floor as he made his way to the counter. Kevin froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then Walter smiled, a small, knowing smile that held no malice, no grudge, only understanding. "Mind if I sit?" Walter asked, motioning to one of the tables near the window. Kevin nodded, still slightly nervous, but gestured for Walter to take a seat. He brought over 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him, the tension between them palpable but not hostile. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They just sipped their coffee, watching the people outside pass by. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "You've done a good job here," he said quietly, his voice calm and measured. "I can see you've learned something from all this." Kevin nodded, his eyes downcast. "I have," he admitted. "I didn't get it before. I thought running a business was just about getting people in and out as fast as possible. But it's more than that. It's about making people feel like they matter." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It took me a long time to learn that too," he said. "But you've done well. I'm proud of you." Kevin looked up, surprised by Walter's words. He hadn't expected that. He had come to terms with his mistakes, but he hadn't realized how much he needed to hear someone, especially Walter, acknowledge that he had changed. They sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. Finally, Walter set his coffee cup down and stood up, his cane steadying him as he made his way toward the door. Before he left, he turned back to Kevin and said, "Second chances don't come around often. Make the most of this one." Kevin watched as Walter walked out the door, disappearing into the flow of people on the street. He sat there for a long time, reflecting on how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. Second chances had given him more than just a fresh start. It had given him a new way of seeing the world, one where respect, kindness, and community were at the heart of everything. And as Kevin looked around his small cafe, filled with people laughing, talking, and enjoying themselves, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the place he was always meant to be. Maple Street had changed, and so had he. But in the end, it was for the better, for both of them. The cafe on Maple Street, now a hub of activity, had transformed not only the block, but the entire atmosphere of the town. Walter's nephew, Aaron, had turned the once dull deli into a lively and warm space that invited conversation, creativity, and community. People of all ages now frequented the cafe. Parents with their children, students studying at the large wooden tables, and elderly residents who gathered for a leisurely morning coffee. The cafe felt like the heart of the town, a place where everyone knew each other and new faces were always welcome. Walter had become a regular, not just because it was his nephew's cafe, but because he loved what it had done for the community. He would sit by the window in the mornings, sipping his coffee and watching the street come to life. It brought him a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had played a part in this transformation. The cafe, with its mix of old-world charm and modern flair, had become the kind of place where people felt connected again. It was a stark contrast to how things had felt before, when the town had seemed divided between old and new, and the sense of community had been slowly eroding. But as Walter watched from his usual spot, he couldn't help but reflect on what had been lost along the way. Kevin's old deli, for all its faults, had still been a part of the town's history. Walter had never intended for the changes he set in motion to destroy Kevin's livelihood. He had only wanted to remind people, including Kevin, of the importance of respect and treating others with dignity. He wondered now if things had gone too far, if perhaps Kevin's downfall had been more painful than he had intended. It was with this in mind that Walter decided to check on Kevin's new cafe. Second chances. He had heard through the grapevine that it was doing well, and that Kevin had made some serious changes in how he ran the place. Walter had always believed in second chances, and from what he had gathered, Kevin was taking his in stride. Still, Walter hadn't set foot inside yet, unsure of how it would feel to be in Kevin's space after everything that had happened. One Saturday morning, Walter decided it was time. He left his usual spot at Aaron's cafe and made his way across town to the quieter part of the city, where Second Chances was tucked away. The walk was slow but peaceful, the early autumn air cool against his skin. As he approached the cafe, he noticed how different it was from the old deli. The exterior was simple, almost understated, but there was a warmth about it that made it feel inviting. The name, hand-painted on the window, carried a quiet sense of redemption, and Walter smiled at the thought. Kevin had chosen well. When Walter stepped inside, the first thing that struck him was the atmosphere. It was calm, almost serene, with soft music playing in the background and the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. The cafe wasn't crowded, but there were enough people inside to give it a comfortable buzz. The decor was simple: wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and local artwork on the walls. It wasn't trendy or pretentious, but it felt real, like the kind of place where people could sit for hours and feel at home. Kevin was behind the counter, chatting with a customer as he made coffee. Walter watched him for a moment, noticing the way Kevin moved, calm, collected, and with a new sense of ease that hadn't been there before. He seemed more grounded, more connected to what he was doing, and it was clear that he had taken the lessons of the past to heart. Walter took a seat at one of the tables near the window and waited, unsure if Kevin had noticed him yet. A few minutes later, Kevin came over, wiping his hands on his apron, his expression shifting from surprise to something warmer. "Walter," Kevin said, his voice softer than usual, "I didn't expect to see you here." Walter smiled, gesturing to the cafe around them. "I thought it was about time I came by. This place, it's different from the old Deli, but in a good way." Kevin nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from Walter. "Yeah," he said, his voice filled with a kind of humility that Walter hadn't heard before. "I wanted to do something different this time. I learned a lot from what happened back at the Deli. I needed to slow down, really think about what people wanted, what they needed. I didn't realize how much that mattered until it was too late." There was a long pause between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a pause filled with reflection, both men thinking about the past and how far they had come since that day at the Deli. "I never wanted to hurt you, Kevin," Walter finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "That wasn't my intention. I just wanted you to understand that people, everyone, deserve respect, especially in a place like this where people come to feel a little less alone." Kevin sighed, nodding slowly. "I know," he admitted. "I didn't get it at the time, but I do now. I wasn't just running a business. I was part of the community, and I didn't see how important that was. I was too focused on making everything fast and efficient, and I forgot that the people walking through the door were more than just customers." Walter could see the sincerity in Kevin's eyes, and it made him feel a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't easy to admit when you were wrong, but Kevin had done it, and that meant more to Walter than anything else. He had always believed in second chances, and now he saw that Kevin had truly earned his. "So," Walter said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "tell me about this place. How did second chances come about?" Kevin leaned back in his chair, smiling for the first time since they started talking. "Well, after the Deli closed, I had a lot of time to think. I went away for a bit, cleared my head, and when I came back, I knew I needed to do something different. I didn't want to just open another deli or cafe. I wanted to create a place where people could come and feel like they had a fresh start, like they were part of something. That's where the name came from. I needed a second chance, and I figured other people did too." Walter nodded, impressed by Kevin's thoughtfulness. The cafe truly felt like a place for second chances, not just for Kevin, but for the people who walked through its doors. It was the kind of place where you could leave your troubles behind for a while, where you could feel seen and heard, even if only for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. The two men continued talking for a while, sharing stories about the town, the people they knew, and how much things had changed over the years. It was a conversation neither of them had expected to have, but it felt right. There was no lingering resentment, no bitterness, only a shared understanding of what had been and what was now. As the morning wore on, Walter stood to leave, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. Kevin walked him to the door, and just before Walter stepped outside, Kevin stopped him. "Walter," he said, his voice serious but kind, Thank you. For everything. I didn't see it at first, but I needed that wake-up call. I wouldn't be here without it." Walter smiled, resting his hand on the doorframe. "We all need second chances, Kevin. Just make sure you use yours wisely." With that, Walter walked out into the crisp autumn air, the sun shining brightly overhead. As he made his way back down the street, he felt a deep sense of peace. The town had changed, but it was still the town he loved. And now it was better, stronger, more connected. In the weeks that followed, Second Chances became a fixture in the community. It was different from Aaron's Cafe, but both places thrived, each offering something unique to the town. People had options now, places where they could go to feel part of something bigger than themselves. And in a way, Walter had been the catalyst for it all, quietly nudging the town back toward the values it had once held dear. Walter continued his morning walks, passing by both cafes with a sense of pride. The town had found its heart again, and in doing so, it had given everyone a second chance. Kevin, Aaron, and even Walter himself. The change had been slow and sometimes painful, but in the end, it had been worth it. And so, Maple Street flourished, not because of one cafe or one person, but because the town had remembered what mattered most: community, respect, and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. Months passed, and the changes that had swept through Maple Street became part of the town's new normal. What had begun with the quiet sale of a building had transformed into a wider resurgence of community spirit, a revitalization that stretched beyond just the physical spaces of the town. The cafes, both Aaron's modern, bustling spot and Kevin's more intimate, soul-soothing refuge, served as symbols of how the town had grown without losing its core identity. The people who lived there, from the youngest newcomers to the oldest residents, felt more connected than they had in years. Walter Davis, now 90 years old, had witnessed the transformation with a quiet satisfaction. He continued his daily walks through town, his cane tapping gently on the pavement as he moved down the familiar streets. Every step brought him past places that were once merely backdrops to his routine, but now they seemed to hold deeper meaning. He saw Aaron's Cafe filled with customers, many of them chatting with his nephew, who had made the place an extension of himself, warm, welcoming, and full of life. And when he passed Kevin's Second Chances, he saw people sitting contentedly at tables, the atmosphere serene, their faces relaxed as they sipped coffee or read a book in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. It was clear to Walter that something special had happened here. But while the town had flourished, Walter found himself reflecting on the nature of change, both personal and communal. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that the town's transformation wasn't just about new businesses or updated buildings. It was about the people. It was about how individuals like Kevin had been able to grow and learn, and how Walter himself had taken steps, however small, to push the town in the right direction. On an unseasonably warm autumn morning, Walter walked slowly toward the park, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot as he made his way to his favorite bench. His body was tired these days, but his mind remained sharp, and he found that his morning walks were the best time for him to clear his head. He sat down, looking out at the park where families played and dogs barked happily. He was struck by how peaceful it all seemed, how far things had come. As he sat there, his mind drifted to the years before the change. He thought about how he had lived in the town when everything felt static, when people came and went from the deli without a second thought, when neighbors were polite but distant, and when the sense of belonging had begun to slip away without anyone noticing. It hadn't been intentional, but the town had slowly lost the very thing that made it special. In a way, that day at the deli, when Kevin had refused to make him a simple ham and cheese sandwich, had been a turning point, not just for Walter, but for the entire town. At the time, it had felt like a personal slight, a humiliation that had cut him deeper than he wanted to admit. But now, looking back, Walter could see it was the spark that had set everything into motion. Walter's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. He turned to see Kevin walking toward him, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression a mixture of curiosity and warmth. It wasn't unusual for them to run into each other, but Kevin seemed to have sought Walter out this time. "Mind if I sit?" Kevin asked, gesturing to the empty spot beside Walter on the bench. Walter nodded, shifting over slightly to make room. "Not at all. It's a nice day to sit and think." Kevin sat down, glancing at the park before turning to Walter. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Kevin said, his voice contemplative. "About the cafe, about how things have changed since everything happened." Walter gave him a sidelong glance, waiting for him to continue. "I guess I just wanted to say thank you," Kevin said after a moment, his words sincere. "I don't think I ever really said that. I didn't understand it back then, but what happened, it needed to happen. I wasn't running the deli right. I wasn't treating people right. And I didn't realize how much I was missing until it was gone." Walter smiled faintly, nodding. "You were going through the motions, Kevin. It happens to a lot of people. We get stuck in our ways, thinking that the way we've always done things is the only way. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to see that things need to change." Kevin looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed. "It wasn't just about the business. It was about how I was living my life. I was so focused on making the deli a success that I stopped paying attention to the people around me. I didn't realize how much people wanted more than just a sandwich. They wanted to feel like they mattered. That's what I've been trying to do with Second Chances. I'm not just serving food anymore. I'm creating a space where people can come and feel like they belong." Walter looked out at the park, the faint smile still playing on his lips. "You've done well, Kevin. I've seen it. People in this town appreciate what you've built. They see the effort you're putting in, and they feel it. That's what makes the difference." Kevin was quiet for a moment, his gaze following a couple walking hand in hand along the path. "It's funny," he said after a pause, "how much this place has changed. It feels different now, like the town has found its heart again." Walter nodded. "It has. But it's not just the town. It's the people. Change like this doesn't come from buildings or businesses. It comes from the people who care about the community. You, Aaron, everyone who's put their heart into making this place better. You're the reason the town feels alive again." Kevin took a deep breath, letting the weight of Walter's words settle over him. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this. When I first started the deli, I thought success was about making money, about efficiency. But now I see it's about more than that. It's about connection, about being part of something bigger than yourself." Walter's eyes softened as he looked at Kevin. "That's the real lesson, isn't it? It's not just about what you do, but about how you do it. How you treat people, how you make them feel. That's what lasts. That's what people remember." They sat in silence for a while, both of them reflecting on how far they had come, both as individuals and as members of the community. The town had changed, but it had also stayed the same in the ways that mattered most. The sense of belonging, of being part of something meaningful, had been restored. Eventually, Kevin stood, stretching his legs as he prepared to leave. "I should get back to the cafe," he said, his tone light. "But it was good talking to you, Walter. Really good." Walter smiled up at him, his eyes bright with the wisdom of his years. "You're doing great, Kevin. Don't forget that. And remember, it's not just about second chances. It's about what you do with them." Kevin nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He gave Walter a small wave before heading off down the path, his steps lighter than they had been in a long time. Walter watched him go, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. The town had found its footing again, and so had he. His part in the story might have been small, a quiet nudge here, a bit of guidance there, but it had made all the difference. He had reminded people of what really mattered, and in doing so, he had helped bring the town back to life. As he sat there, watching the world move around him, Walter knew that the changes that had taken place weren't just temporary. They were the kind of changes that lasted, the kind that stuck with people long after the initial excitement had faded. Maple Street had found its heart again, and it would carry that heart forward, long into the future. Walter stood slowly, leaning on his cane as he began his walk back home. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the park and the town beyond. And as he walked, he couldn't help but feel that he had played his part well, that his life had mattered in ways he hadn't expected. The town would continue to grow and change, just as it always had. But now it had something stronger to carry it through. An understanding that at the center of every community is the simple, powerful need for connection. And as long as that need was met, Maple Street would thrive. With that thought in his heart, Walter made his way down the familiar streets, content in the knowledge that both he and the town had found their place in the world once more. Walter Davis had always been a man of routine. At 89 years old, living in the same small town he called home for decades, his days were structured, familiar, and comforting in their simplicity. Every morning, he would wake up at 6 a.m. sharp, make his bed with military precision, and take a short walk around the quiet streets, nodding at the few early risers he passed. His routine helped keep him grounded, a way to feel connected to the world around him, even as the town had changed over the years. The Deli on Maple Street had been a part of Walter's life for as long as he could remember. He had known the original owner, Mrs. O'Donnell, a kind woman with a soft spot for the town's elders. Walter had been coming to the deli since it opened, always ordering the same thing: a ham and cheese sandwich on rye, with a side of pickles. Mrs. O'Donnell had passed away a few years back, and her son had sold the deli to new owners, a young couple looking to make a name for themselves. They had spruced up the place, added trendy new sandwiches to the menu, and brought in a manager to help run things. This particular morning, Walter made his way to the deli just like any other day. The air was crisp, the kind that heralds the coming of autumn, and Walter savored the feeling of it on his skin as he ambled down Maple Street. When he arrived at the deli, the bell above the door tinkled as he stepped inside. The place was more crowded than usual, filled with the hum of people chatting over coffee and sandwiches. Walter spotted the new manager, Kevin, behind the counter, barking orders to the staff with a sense of urgency that felt out of place in the typically laid-back town. Walter stood in line, quietly waiting his turn, watching the scene unfold. Kevin, a man in his late 30s with slicked back hair and a permanent scowl, didn't seem to be enjoying his job. He handled orders quickly but without care, rarely making eye contact with customers, his attention always on the clock or the kitchen. When it was finally Walter's turn, he stepped up to the counter and smiled politely, out of habit. "Morning," Walter said, his voice steady but soft. "I'll have a ham and cheese on rye, please. No mustard, just plain." Kevin glanced at Walter, his expression blank. "We don't make that anymore," he said flatly, tapping the touch screen in front of him. "You'll have to pick something from the menu." Walter blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, well, that's all right," he said, his voice calm. "Could you maybe just make the ham and cheese? It doesn't have to be fancy." Kevin's eyes flickered with impatience. He sighed loudly, shaking his head. "We don't do custom orders, old man. Pick something from the board or move aside. There are people waiting." A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, and the chatter in the deli seemed to dull for a moment. Walter felt his face flush, a heat rising in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked up at the new menu, filled with items he didn't recognize: gourmet sandwiches with ingredients like avocado and artisanal cheeses. None of it appealed to him, but he wasn't sure what to do next. "I've been coming here for years," Walter said, trying to keep his tone even. "I always get the same thing. It's just a ham and cheese." Kevin rolled his eyes dramatically, his patience clearly worn thin. "Look, we don't have time for this. Either order something from the menu or leave." Walter stood there, frozen, his pride wounded in a way that stung deeper than he expected. It wasn't about the sandwich anymore. It was about the way he was being treated, as though he were nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience to be brushed aside. His eyes swept the deli, hoping for some sign of sympathy, but the other customers avoided his gaze, their eyes downcast or focused on their phones, unwilling to intervene. "I see," Walter said quietly. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the deli, the bell above the door tinkling softly as it closed behind him. Outside, the crisp air that had felt refreshing moments ago now felt cold and biting. Walter stood on the sidewalk for a moment, collecting his thoughts, trying to shake off the humiliation that clung to him like a second skin.